So if you're thinking about how best to prepare for graduate study, whether it's a PhD or a master's degree, of course you're already thinking about the importance of doing well in your classes, but don't fall into the notion that you have to have a 4.0 to get into a PhD program in clinical psychology, which I think gets thrown around. Although you should know that when you're applying amongst students who are very strong academically. Bowdoin's a very well-respected school, so if you do well here, that would be seen very favorably. The GREs are important, and that comes into play particularly, for example, if you do exceptionally well on the GREs, you may be awarded a fellowship, which means that you would be funded without having to do a teaching assistantship or a research assistantship, which can be really helpful to sort of focus on your schoolwork without having that distraction, although I would argue that having those assistantships is also part of your training and education as well. So that's certainly not a bad thing. Beyond that, you really want to focus on two things to prepare for graduate study. One is getting some exposure or clinical training, and that doesn't mean you have to do psychotherapy or work in the exact type of setting that you're interested in working in or you think you might be interested in working in, but just that you have some training. And it might look like being a peer career counselor. It might look like volunteering on a crisis hotline and learning some basic helping skills so that you can be supportive to someone who calls in crisis. It might look like taking the abnormal psychology class at Bowdoin, where you would be volunteering at Mid-Coast Hospital's behavioral health unit and having some exposure to inpatient populations. It might look like doing some type of externship or summer work with children with behavioral problems, working with special populations in any capacity, any sort of broadly defined helping role. And it's all how you would sort of frame that in an admissions essay. But I would say more important than that, particularly for a PhD program, is research training, some type of research that goes beyond your research methods class. So while you're an undergrad, you could work with a professor as a research assistant. Even better, do an independent study where you are working on your own research project, or an honors project where you're doing an independent research, collecting data, going through all stages of the research process under the guidance of an advisor, which really is sort of a little mini model of what it would look like in graduate school. Sort of your honors project at Bowdoin, I think, is comparable to many master's theses. When I talk about research experience, it does not have to be research in clinical psychology or even research in psychology. When I was an undergrad, I did a lot of research in speech communication. I did research in cognitive psychology with infants. And I did research in memory. So none of that was, what I ended up doing was women's career development as a counseling psychologist. And that didn't so much matter, but I was able to demonstrate that I had a lot of knowledge of the research process and that my interests really came out of my own experiences in terms of my interest in the specific area of research. Also with clinical training, I got a lot of my clinical training with children, and I'm not particularly interested. I don't work with children in my practice, nor did I go with a child-focused graduate program. Any kind of helping skills training that you can get, whether it's in educational settings or hospital settings, is great. If you find that you've had minimal research experience and you're approaching graduation or you've graduated, that would be an argument for either applying to a master's program first, rather than a PhD program, because you will get research experience and do a thesis in your master's program. And oftentimes master's programs will emphasize maybe more clinical experience and understand that if you've taken research methods and done some data collection, then that will suffice for entry into a master's program. So don't think you have to go out and work as a research assistant for 2 years. You could apply to a master's program for that. Although you could go out and perhaps get a job as a research assistant or seek that somewhere else to get your research experience. But it's critical for a PhD program that you have some additional research experience. There are summer research apprenticeships available. I did one at another university when I was an undergraduate. That was a really valuable experience. You can be creative with that, but it's really important. So I would say with the PhD program, they're going to emphasize research experience and that you have some evidence of clinical training that supports your interest in psychology. And that with a master's program or a PsyD, they may look for more clinical experience and emphasize less your research experience. There's one book I would highly recommend if you're interested in doctoral programs, and that is called The Insider's Guide to Applying to Graduate School in Clinical and Counseling Psychology. And that is a book that will talk in detail about every possible PhD program you could apply to. You could learn about admissions requirements, typical statistics of admitted students in terms of GPA, GRE, the faculty research interests, and also every PhD program is ranked according to how research or clinically oriented it is. Admissions essays become a focus once you're at the point of application. They're very important, as well as recommendations. I will say, too, that if you do engage in research or clinical training, you often get to know a faculty member or supervisor much more closely than you would just by sitting in a class and even being an exceptional student, because the letters of recommendation really need to be exceptional. So finding 3 people who can speak very highly and highly recommend you for a doctoral program is another thing that's going to distinguish you from a group of highly qualified applicants.